Every spring, hundreds of sheep now move quietly between long rows of chestnut trees on a farm in northern Missouri. The grass beneath their feet is thick and green. Clover grows between the rows. Birds move through the branches, and when the wind blows, thousands of leaves ripple across a field that once looked almost dead. At the far end of the property, workers stack bags of fresh chestnuts beside a small wooden building. Some will be sold to local grocery stores. Others will go to restaurants in Kansas City and St. Louis. A few will be shipped directly to families who order them every fall. Looking at the farm today, most people assume the land must have always been rich. It was not. Less than 10 years earlier, the same field was dry, exposed, and badly worn down. Deep cracks opened across parts of the ground during summer. Heavy rain carried dark lines of topsoil toward the road. Corn yields kept dropping. Fertilizer bills kept rising, and every year the land seemed to demand more while giving less in return. Most people in the area believed the field had reached the end of its useful life. Some suggested selling it. Others said the only solution was to use more fertilizer, plant another corn crop, and hope for better weather. But one farmer looked at the tired soil and made a decision almost nobody understood. His name was David Miller. David was 44 years old when he took over the farm from his father. He was tall, quiet, and more comfortable fixing a fence than speaking in front of a crowd. His hands were rough from years of work, and he usually wore the same faded green cap his father had given him when he was a teenager. The Miller family had farmed that land for 3 generations. David's grandfather had raised cattle, grown hay, and planted small fields of corn. His father expanded the row crops during the 1980s and 1990s, when bigger equipment made it possible to farm more land with fewer people. By the time David took over, nearly the entire property was planted in corn and soybeans. For many years, the system worked. Then the problems became harder to ignore. The soil dried faster during hot summers. Rainwater stopped soaking into certain areas and began running across the surface. Small gullies appeared after storms. In some places, the ground became so hard that David could barely push a shovel into it. He tried doing what farmers around him had always done. He changed fertilizer programs. He bought better seed. He adjusted planting dates. He spent more money on equipment. Some years were better than others, but the larger problem never disappeared. The land was losing its ability to recover. One August afternoon, David stood near the center of the field after almost 6 weeks without meaningful rain. The corn leaves had curled inward. The ground was pale and hard. Dust rose around his boots with every step. His wife, Sarah, walked out to meet him. She carried 2 bottles of water and handed one to him. "How bad is it?" she asked. David looked across the field. "Worse than last year." Sarah waited. She knew he did not like talking about money, especially when things were difficult. Finally, David said, "We can keep borrowing and hope next year changes everything. And if it doesn't," he looked down at the soil. "I don't know." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table after their 2 children had gone to bed. Bills covered one side of the table. Farm records covered the other. For the first time, David seriously considered selling part of the property. The thought made him feel like he had failed. His grandfather had worked that land with horses. His father had spent his entire life expanding the farm. David believed he was supposed to protect what they had built. Instead, he was watching the soil disappear, one storm at a time. A few weeks later, David attended a small agricultural meeting in Columbia. He almost did not go. A neighbor had mentioned there would be a speaker talking about soil health, grazing, and trees. David expected another presentation full of expensive ideas that looked good on paper but would never work on a real farm. Then one photograph caught his attention. It showed sheep grazing beneath rows of mature trees. The speaker called the system silvopasture. Instead of separating trees, livestock, and grass into different areas, the system combined them. The trees provided shade, roots, and a long-term crop. The grass protected the soil. The animals controlled vegetation and returned nutrients to the ground. David raised his hand. What kind of trees? The speaker explained that farmers use different species depending on the region and the market. Some planted timber trees, some grew fruit. Others planted nuts. Then he showed a photograph of a chestnut orchard. David leaned forward. Chestnut trees could produce food for decades. Their roots stayed in the ground year after year. They did not require the soil to be opened and replanted every spring. The nuts also had value. American grocery stores imported many chestnuts because domestic production remained limited in many areas. Local growers could sell fresh nuts directly to customers, markets, bakeries, and restaurants. David wrote one word in the corner of his notebook: chestnuts. For the next 3 months, he read everything he could find. He learned about hybrid chestnut varieties, selected for disease resistance and cold tolerance. He studied orchard spacing, pollination, irrigation, pruning, and harvest. He also learned how complicated the system could become when animals were added. Sheep could control grass and weeds between the rows. Their manure could return nutrients to the field, but sheep could also destroy young trees. They could strip leaves, damage bark, break branches, and turn a promising orchard into a disaster in a single afternoon. The more David learned, the less certain he became. Still, one idea stayed with him. What if the farm did not need another product that took more from the soil? What if it needed a system that could earn money while rebuilding the land? The following spring, David ordered 600 young chestnut trees. When the delivery truck arrived, his neighbor, Tom Reynolds, drove over to see what was happening. Tom climbed out of his pickup and stared at the small trees. "What are those?" "Chestnuts." Tom looked toward the old cornfield. "You're putting trees out there?" "That's the plan." "How long before they make anything?" "A few years." Tom laughed. "A few years?" David smiled. "I know. You're taking a cornfield and turning it into a forest." "Not exactly." Tom shook his head. "I hope you know something the rest of us don't." The truth was, David did not. He had a plan, but no guarantee. That spring, he planted the trees in long rows across 35 acres. The field looked strange. Thin plastic tree guards stood in straight lines where corn had grown for decades. Most of the trees were barely taller than David's knees. Between the rows, he planted a mix of grasses and clover. For the first time in years, he did not prepare the entire field for corn. Some neighbors slowed down when they passed. A few stopped to ask questions. Others joked that David was building the world's slowest orchard. Then summer arrived. The rain stopped. Temperatures stayed high for weeks. Even with a small irrigation system, many of the young trees struggled. Their leaves turned brown around the edges. Some stopped growing. By September, nearly 90 trees were dead. David walked each row with a notebook, marking losses. Every dead tree felt like proof that his neighbors had been right. That fall, he replaced as many as he could. The next year, he brought sheep onto the farm. He started with 60 animals. At first, the system looked promising. The sheep moved through the grass, eating weeds David would otherwise have mowed. Their manure spread naturally across the field. The ground remained covered. Then one afternoon, a gate was left open. The flock entered a section with smaller trees. By the time David discovered them, several tree guards had been pushed over. Branches were broken. Leaves had been stripped from dozens of young chestnuts. David stood in the middle of the damage without saying a word. Sarah walked up behind him. "Can they recover?" "Some of them. And the rest? We'll replace them." He sounded calm, but that night he barely slept. The next morning, he redesigned the grazing system. He divided the orchard into smaller paddocks, using temporary electric fencing. The sheep would stay in one area for a short time and then move to fresh grass. Young trees received stronger guards. The flock was never allowed into a new section without someone checking the fences first. It took more work, but the system improved. Then came the storm. During the third spring, nearly 5 inches of rain fell in less than 2 days. Water rushed across a section where the ground cover had not fully developed. A shallow channel formed between 2 rows of trees. soil collected near the bottom of the field. David followed the path of the water until he reached the road. Years earlier, he might have repaired the damage and moved on. This time, he stopped and studied it. The water had moved fastest where the soil was bare. In areas with thick clover and grass, the ground had stayed in place. That difference changed the way he managed the farm. He spread more seed in weak areas. He stopped mowing the orchard short. He allowed deeper roots to develop. He moved the sheep more frequently, so they would not graze the plants too close to the ground. Slowly, the field began to behave differently. Rainwater disappeared into the soil instead of collecting on the surface. The grass stayed green longer during dry weather. When David pushed a shovel into the ground, the soil no longer broke into hard, dusty pieces. It held together. It smelled rich. One afternoon, his son found a large earthworm near the base of a chestnut tree. "Dad, look!" David turned. His son held the worm in both hands. For most people, it would have meant nothing. David smiled. "Put him back." "Why?" "Because he's working." By the fourth year, the chestnut trees were taller than David. Their branches had begun spreading across the rows. In summer, small areas of shade appeared beneath them. The sheep started resting there during the hottest part of the afternoon. David noticed they spent less time crowded around the water tanks. The grass beneath the trees also looked different. Some areas stayed green longer because the soil was not exposed to direct sunlight all day. The system still required careful management, but for the first time, David could see what it might become. Then, one September morning, he found 3 chestnuts on the ground. They were small. One had insect damage. Another was not fully developed. The third looked almost perfect. David picked it up and carried it to the house. Sarah was making coffee. He placed the chestnut on the kitchen table. She looked at it. "Is that from our farm?" He nodded. She smiled. "After all this time?" "After all this time." That first harvest fit inside a few plastic crates. David sold some at a farmer's market. He expected most people to walk past. Instead, customers stopped to ask questions. Many had never seen locally grown chestnuts. Some remembered eating roasted chestnuts when they were children. A restaurant owner bought several bags and asked whether David could provide more the following year. "We're still small," David explained. "How small?" David looked at the remaining crates. "This is almost everything." The restaurant owner laughed. "Then call me next season." The money from the first harvest did not change the farm, but it proved something. The trees could produce. And while the orchard continued growing, the sheep were already creating income. David sold lambs each year. He also reduced the amount of mowing he needed to do. The sheep turned grass into a product while helping manage the orchard. The land was no longer waiting years to become useful. It was producing in more than one way. A local soil specialist visited the property the following spring. She collected samples from the orchard and compared them with soil from a nearby field that was still managed as annual cropland. She was careful not to make dramatic promises. "Soil changes slowly," she told David, but several signs were encouraging. The orchard soil held more visible organic material near the surface. Plant roots reached deeper. Water entered the ground more easily in areas with strong grass cover. The field was not finished recovering. It might never stop changing, but it was moving in the right direction. Word spread. At first, people came because they were curious. Then they came because they wanted to learn. Farmers walked between the rows asking about tree spacing, fencing, sheep breeds, and markets. Some were interested in chestnuts. Others simply wanted to know how David kept soil covered during difficult weather. Tom Reynolds returned one afternoon. The trees were now large enough to create long shadows across the grass. Sheep grazed quietly between the rows. Tom stood near the same place where he had laughed years earlier. "I'll admit it," he said. "I thought this was crazy." David smiled. "You weren't the only one. How much are the trees producing now?" "More every year." "And the sheep?" "They pay bills while the trees grow." Tom looked across the farm. So you get nuts and livestock from the same land? That's the idea. Tom pushed the toe of his boot into the soil. The ground was soft. What did you put on this? Mostly plants. Tom looked confused. David pointed toward the grass. Roots in the ground. Cover on the surface. Sheep moving through. Time. By the 7th year, the farm looked completely different. The chestnut trees formed clear rows of green across the property. Their roots held the soil. Their fallen leaves covered the ground each autumn. The grass between them supported a larger flock. The sheep had shade during hot summers and protection from strong winds. David still purchased feed during difficult periods, but the farm depended more on living pasture than it had before. The chestnut harvest had grown large enough to require new equipment. David and Sarah bought a small nut cleaner and converted an old machinery shed into a packing area. Their daughter designed simple labels for the bags. Miller Family Chestnuts. Every fall, customers arrived at the farm. Families filled baskets. Children watched sheep move through the orchard. Some visitors came only to buy nuts. Others stayed for hours, asking how the system worked. David always gave the same warning. This didn't happen quickly. He showed them photographs from the first year. Small trees, bare ground, broken guards, dead seedlings. Most visitors were surprised. They had seen the finished farm and assumed the plan had worked perfectly. It had not. The system succeeded because David kept adjusting it. He changed grazing times. He improved fences. He replanted trees. He experimented with grasses. He learned when to move the sheep and when to keep them away. The farm was not built from one brilliant decision. It was built from hundreds of small corrections. One October morning, a group of local farmers visited during harvest. David led them toward the oldest section of the orchard. Chestnuts covered the ground beneath the trees. Workers collected them in buckets. Nearby, sheep grazed a section that had already been harvested. An older farmer named Bill stopped near the edge of the field. Years earlier, Bill had told David he was wasting good farmland. Now he stood quietly for several minutes. Finally, he said, "I drove past this place for years." David nodded. "I remember. I kept waiting for you to give up." David laughed. "So did I sometimes." Bill looked down at the grass. "We spent most of our lives trying to keep trees out of fields." He looked toward the sheep. "Now people are coming here to learn how to put them back." David did not argue. He understood why farmers were skeptical. Land was expensive. Mistakes were expensive. Waiting several years for a tree crop required patience many families could not afford. That was why the animals mattered. The sheep created income before the chestnuts reached full production. They gave the farm another product. They also reduced some vegetation management. The trees and livestock were not competing systems. When managed carefully, they supported each other. By the end of that harvest, the farm had sold chestnuts to grocery stores, restaurants, bakeries, and customers in several states. The sheep operation continued growing, but money was only part of what had changed. After large storms, David no longer found the same dark streams of soil leaving the field. During dry summers, the ground held moisture longer. Birds nested in the orchard. Beneficial insects appeared among the clover. The field was productive, but it also felt alive. One evening, David stood near the highest point of the farm. The sun was setting behind the chestnut rows. Sheep moved slowly toward fresh pasture. His son, now a teenager, walked beside him. "Do you think Grandpa would like this?" the boy asked. David looked across the land. His father had believed good farming meant producing as much as possible from every acre. David still respected that. His father had believed good farming meant producing as much as possible from every acre. David still respected that. His father had believed good farming meant producing as much as possible from every acre. David still respected that. His father had believed good farming meant producing as much as possible from every acre. David still respected that. It should become stronger for the next generation. "I think he'd ask a lot of questions," David said. His son laughed. "Would he think it's strange?" "At first. And after that, David watched the sheep disappear between the trees. I think he'd understand. The farm never became perfect. Some trees still died. Fences still broke. Markets changed. Weather remained unpredictable. There were wet years, dry years, late freezes, and difficult harvests. No farming system could remove risk. But David no longer depended on one crop, one season, or one source of income. The trees produced nuts. The pasture fed sheep. The animals helped manage vegetation. The roots protected soil. Each part supported another. And the land that once seemed exhausted had become the most valuable part of the farm. Not because someone discovered a miracle fertilizer, not because David forced the soil to produce more. The land changed because he stopped treating every problem separately. The trees, animals, grass, water, and soil were allowed to work together. Years earlier, people had seen a failed cornfield. David had seen the possibility of something different. At first, that possibility looked like rows of tiny trees surrounded by empty space. Then it looked like broken branches, dead seedlings, damaged fences, and years of waiting. But slowly, roots grew deeper. Grass covered the ground. Sheep returned nutrients to the soil. Rain began soaking in. The first chestnuts fell. Then the next harvest became larger. And little by little, a field people had almost given up on became a place that supported a family, fed animals, produced valuable food, and taught an entire community to look at farmland in a different way. Today, when visitors ask David what saved the farm, they usually expect a complicated answer. He gives them a simple one. We stopped asking how much more we could take from the land. Then he looks toward the chestnut trees. And we started asking what the land needed so it could keep giving. Maybe that lesson reaches beyond farming. Sometimes, when something looks worn out, unproductive, or broken, our first instinct is to push harder. Add more, demand more, give it one last chance to perform. But recovery does not always begin with pressure. Sometimes it begins with protection, with patience, with deeper roots, with giving living things enough time to rebuild what has been lost. That Missouri field was never truly dead. It was tired. It had spent decades giving. And when someone finally changed the way it was treated, the land responded. Not overnight, not without mistakes, but season by season, root by root, until the same ground that once seemed unable to support another future became the foundation of one.